Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's November 30th, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're discussing a major investigative report published by Mongabay earlier this month that uncovered an illegal shark finning operation conducted across the fleet of one of China's biggest tuna fishing companies. We speak with Mongabay's senior editor for Southeast Asia, Philip Jacobson, who conducted the investigation together with Basten Gokkon, a senior Indonesia staff writer for Mongabay. Phil tells us about the company, Dalian Ocean Fishing, and how he and Basten discovered that the company was using banned fishing gear to deliberately catch sharks in international waters on such a massive scale that the shark catch for the entire country of China may have been undercounted for years. We also speak with Mongabay contributor Annelise Giseburt, a freelance journalist who conducted a follow-up investigation into who was doing business with Dalian Ocean Fishing while it was conducting its illegal shark finning operation. Annelise tells us that most of Dalian Ocean Fishing's tuna was purchased by the seafood trading arm of Japan's Mitsubishi Corporation.
There's really low understanding in Japan about where some of their tuna comes from and what takes place on these fishing vessels catching wild tuna for the Japanese market. Because all these incidents happen way out at sea, beyond anyone's sight, and then also on foreign fishing vessels as well. So there's a real disconnect between the supply chain and then the market and then the consumers.
Back in September of 2021, Mongabay published its first expose of Dalian Ocean Fishing, an investigation that looked into the company's labor practices and the living conditions on its fishing vessels. That investigation came after the news broke that 4 Indonesian deckhands had fallen sick and died from unknown illnesses due to the horrendous conditions on one of Dalian's boats. A reporting team that consisted of Phil Jacobson and Basten Gokkon from Mongabay, as well as reporters with the Japanese investigative outlet Tansa and the Environmental Reporting Collective, a network of journalists in more than a dozen countries, tracked down a number of the Indonesian men who had worked on Dalian's boats and found that the abuses that led to the 4 deaths were actually widespread and systematic across Dalian Ocean Fishing's fleet. As Phil tells us, this new investigation into the illegal shark finning activities conducted by many of Dalian's boats also relied on the testimony of several of the Indonesian men who worked on those boats.
Over the past 2 years, we've tracked down and interviewed nearly 24 men who worked on this company's boats between 2018 and 2020. And through interviewing these men, we were able to get a picture of what was going on all across this company's fleet. So it's got 35 boats, and we talked to men from more than half of its boats. And what we found was that this company was running a massive illegal shark fishing and shark finning operation in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans.
So you had published a previous report about the labor and living conditions on Dalian Ocean Fishing's boats. Did this investigation into the shark finning basically come out of that previous investigation?
Yes, it did. So I suppose the story of how we came to investigate this company starts in May 2020 when one of the boats belonging to this company, Dalian Ocean Fishing, it made international headlines because 4 of its Indonesian crew members fell sick and died on board. And so, according to the rest of the crew members who were also from Indonesia, the deckhands on this boat had been subject to really horrible living and working conditions. So this case caused a lot of waves in Indonesia and internationally, and it led to the prosecution of some labor recruiters in Indonesia for human trafficking. And these men were sent to prison. And it was a really big deal, but it was just one boat. And meanwhile, this company has 35 boats. It's a major producer of sashimi grade tuna, mostly for the Japanese market. And it's what's called a distant water fishing company. So distant water fishing is when you fish outside your own country's territorial waters. So that means you're either fishing on the high seas in international waters, or you're fishing in other countries' territorial waters, if maybe your country has a bilateral agreement with that country, for example. This company has claimed to be China's biggest supplier of sashimi-grade tuna to Japan, which is one of the world's biggest seafood consumers. So it's a pretty big company. It was founded in the year 2000 with just 3 boats. I think by 2010, it had 7 boats. And then in the early 2010s, it embarked on this huge expansion, tripled the size of its fleet, using funds from international investors. By 2019, it had 35 boats. And it was in February 2019 that this boat that would go on to make international headlines, the Longqing 629, it was called, set out on its journey with these Indonesian men, several of whom would later fall ill and die. So after this story made headlines, we set out to figure out what was going on across this company's fleet and to determine if what had happened on this one boat, the horrible living and working conditions, the labor abuses, and also reports of shark finning that had come from this boat were just happening on this one boat or were the norm across the entire fleet. So what we did was we tried to track down and interview as many of the company's other Indonesian crew members as possible. So the first article we published about this company was in late 2021, and it focused on labor abuses all across this company's fleet. For that story, we tracked down and spoke with 13 Indonesian men who worked as deckhands on 8 of this company's boats. At the same time, there was an NGO called the Environmental Justice Foundation, which is based in London and has offices elsewhere in the world. And they investigate the fishing industry. And they, as part of their own project, were also tracking down and interviewing men who worked as deckhands on distant water fishing boats, not just for this one company, but for distant water fishing boats from many different companies in many different countries. When you combined the interviews that we did with 8 men from 13 boats with some additional interviews from some additional boats that this NGO did, we collected testimonies from about 40% of Dalian Ocean Fishing's fleet of around 35 boats. So what we found was that the conditions that were said to be present on the Longqing 629, which is the boat that went viral in May 2020 after 4 of its crew members died, those conditions were present all across this company's fleet, or at least on the 40% of boats that we interviewed men from. So what they said was that they were fed substandard food, they were given possibly dangerous drinking water, and they were made to work excessively. The deckhands said they had to work for at least 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sometimes they could work for 2 days straight without rest. They were given old wilted vegetables, or their main staple was the bait fish that they were threading their tuna hooks with. And then the water that they were drinking was distilled seawater, whereas the senior crew members, who were invariably from China, were drinking bottled water that they had brought with them. The Indonesian and sometimes Filipino deckhands were drinking distilled seawater. And a lot of them said that the water tasted rusty or it was discolored. We also found that men from several other boats belonging to this company had also fallen sick and had exhibited similar symptoms as the men who died on the Longqing 629. When we were interviewing these men about the labor conditions, they also told us that they were finning sharks. And shark finning is illegal pretty much everywhere in the world. Our initial plan was to run an article about that pretty shortly after the story that we published about labor abuses. But it became clear that we had to go back and re-interview a lot of these men because the whole shark fishing and shark finning operation is actually quite complicated. And we had to establish certain facts about what they were doing.
So you went back and investigated these shark finning allegations specifically. Tell us about the findings of that investigation.
So there's 3 main findings from the shark finning story. One is that this company was using banned gear to deliberately catch huge numbers of sharks. This company bills itself as a tuna fishing company, but its boats were actually targeting shark intentionally. This boat's what's called a longline fishing company. So a longline fishing boat is a boat that stretches a very, very long line behind it, which can stretch for kilometers. And off of this main line are hung thousands of branch lines with fishing hooks on the end. So these kinds of fishing boats, they often pull up, even if they're targeting tuna, they often pull up other species as so-called bycatch, so like accidental catch. So a lot of times these longline boats, even if they're out there targeting tuna, they'll still pull up sharks. So there's all kinds of rules about what you can do with the sharks. There's some species you have to throw back. There's some species you can keep. But what you can never do is cut the fins off the shark and throw the body back. So that was the second major finding from our investigation, is that this company was doing precisely that. They were finning the sharks. The reason why companies or why fishers will fin sharks is because the fin is the most valuable part of the shark, because it's used in shark fin soup, which is a very expensive dish that's consumed in East Asia and also other parts of the world. So these boats were deliberately catching sharks. They were finning the sharks. And then the third major finding is the scale of this operation. So what we did was we tried to get figures from the crew members we interviewed about how much shark fin they harvested. Some of them had better recollections than others, but 7 of the men were able to give us pretty good figures for how much shark fin they harvested. And those figures came in the form of number of sacks of fins, number of sacks that they filled up with fins, and how much each sack weighed. If some crew member, for example, said, we filled up 15 sacks of dried shark fin weighing 50 kilograms each, then you can do the math and come up with a figure for how much dried shark fin they harvested during that period of time. And there's a methodology we use that's created by the WWF based on other scientific studies that allows you to convert a figure for dried shark fin to the total number of individual sharks that those fins came from and the total weight of those sharks. And when we performed that calculation, what we found was that just a small number of boats from this one company, just 5 boats from this one company, caught an estimated amount of total shark that is more than what the government of China reported for the nation's entire longline fishing fleet in the same time and place in the Western Pacific Ocean in 2019. So what that indicates is that the Chinese government is drastically underreporting the nation's shark catch. And, if you look at a list of the world's top shark catching nations, China does not appear in the top 20 on that list, which is put out by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. It's based on what countries self-report. So China is not on that list, even though it has the world's biggest fishing fleet. It's got the world's biggest distant water fishing fleet, and it's the biggest market for shark fin. So a lot of people that I talked to said it was, a lot of countries are probably underreporting, but it was pretty odd that China doesn't appear on that list. So the findings indicate that China, may be a top shark catching nation, even though it doesn't self-report as well. So those are the 3 main findings: band gear, shark finning, and then what it says about the scale of China's shark catch.
You explained what long lines are, but what is the band gear that they were using to deliberately target sharks?
These boats were using a combination of what are known as shark lines and wire leaders. So it's 2 kinds of gear. In the Western Pacific Ocean, tuna fisheries, it is illegal to use these 2 gear types simultaneously. So a boat fishing for tuna in the Western Pacific cannot use shark lines and wire leaders together. A shark line and a wire leader, let me explain what those are. So in order to understand what these are, you have to understand how a longline fishing vessel operates. So Dalian Ocean Fishing is a longline fishing company. It has 35 longline fishing boats. And the way a longliner works is it drags with this incredibly long line behind it that can stretch for several kilometers. And then suspended from this main line are, let's say, hundreds, maybe even thousands of branch lines. And each of those branch lines has a hook at the end, a baited hook that is for catching fish. And then the main line is suspended at a certain depth via other lines that are connected to buoys that are floating on the surface. The branch lines with hooks hanging off the main line, if you want to catch tuna, normally you put those at a certain depth in the water, pretty deep. But sharks tend to swim closer to the surface of the water. So if you want to target sharks, you can use what's called a shark line. And a shark line, instead of being attached to the main line, which is down deep in the water, you just attach them to the buoys that are floating on the surface. Or you attach them to what's called the float lines, which connect the buoys to the main line. The central point is that the shark lines, the hook at the end of the shark line is a lot closer to the surface, which is better for targeting sharks. So, we have diagrams in the article that illustrate all this, but that's a shark line. And then a wire leader is essentially you're wrapping wire around what's called the leader, which is the part that connects the line to the hook. So by wrapping wire around this fishing leader, it strengthens the fishing leader. which is important when you're targeting shark because sharks have really, really strong jaws. And so if you're using a regular old monofilament leader, the shark can just bite through it. Whereas if you use a wire leader, you're a lot more likely to actually catch that shark. So in the Western Pacific tuna fisheries, which are regulated by a multilateral organization called the WCPFC, Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, you cannot use wire leaders and fish and shark lines simultaneously. But what we found from interviewing former crew members from the fleet of Dalian Ocean Fishing was that its boats were almost always, if not always, using shark lines and wire leaders simultaneously to deliberately catch sharks, even as they were also targeting tuna. And then this company just caught huge numbers of sharks using this gear. Some crew members would describe catching, 100, 200 sharks in one day.
So if they're catching that many sharks, how would they conceal that? Were there not observers on the boats? And when they'd bring the sharks back to shore, how would they get them off the boat? It seems like an operation that big would be kind of hard to conceal.
As part of this investigation, we tried to find out where the fins were going. So this is a very interesting question. What were these boats doing with these fins? So most of this company's boats operated in the Pacific Ocean. So what we found from talking to the crew members was that even as these boats in the Pacific were periodically offloading their tuna catch onto collecting vessels, which is a pretty standard practice, onto collecting vessels belonging to other companies, which would then take the tuna to port somewhere else, they were keeping their shark fin harvest within their own fleet. So one Dalian Ocean Fishing boat might move its shark fins onto another Dalian Ocean Fishing boat, but it would never move its shark fins onto a non-Dalian Ocean Fishing boat. So the shark fins were only ever kept within the fleet of Dalian Ocean Fishing in the Pacific Ocean. Now, what we heard from these crew members was that sometimes fins from several different boats would be loaded onto one boat that was heading back to China, where the fins would presumably be offloaded somewhere and sold. And so we tried to track down and interview one of these Indonesian deckhands who was on one of these boats that was said to have taken fins back to China. And the closest we got was to two boats, the Longqing 801 and the Longqing 802. We talked to three deckhands from these two boats, and all three of them described a shark fin transshipment that took place very close to the coast of China in Shandong province in late October, early November, or maybe late September, early October 2020. And what they said had happened was the boats were anchored off the coast of Shandong province. And this was just a couple of weeks before all the Indonesian crew members of this company were repatriated, sent back to Indonesia. So they were anchored off the coast of Shandong. Each boat had something like 30, 50 sacks of dried shark fin weighing 50 kilograms each. And the deckhands were woken up after midnight by their respective captains and ordered to move the shark fins onto a third boat. And all of the men we talked to who participated in this transshipment told us that this third boat appeared not to be a part of Dalian Ocean Fishing's fleet. Okay, it didn't look like another Dalian Ocean Fishing boat. It was a smaller boat. It looked like a local fishing boat. It had Chinese writing on the side of it, but it was pretty dark. It was 1 a.m, 2 a.m, 3 a.m. They couldn't really see much more than that. So over the course of several hours, the shark fins were all loaded onto this third boat, as all three boats are kind of anchored off the coast of Shandong. And when it was done, the captains of the Longqing 801 and Longqing 802 got on the third boat, which then sailed off somewhere. And then the next day or the day after that, the captains came back on a different boat and they didn't have the fins with them anymore. So what seems to have happened is that the captains went and sold the fins somewhere. And we don't know, where that might have happened. Did they do it in, somewhere at some little port or some landing area elsewhere in Shandong province, or maybe in another province, or who knows? It could have been anywhere they could have gotten within 1 or 2 days. So, that was as close as we got to figuring out where these fins may have ended up. Now, we ran the accounts of this shark fin transshipment by several experts in the shark fin trade, and all of them said that if these shark fins were imported to China, it was almost certain that they were not declared to Chinese authorities. So this would have been an unreported, unlawful transshipment or importation of dried shark fin. And, this then takes us back to this point about China apparently underreporting its shark catch. So, this isn't necessarily to say that the Chinese government is doing something wrong here, in failing to detect all of the shark catch of its boats. It could be that the boats just aren't reporting their catch to the authorities. So then you can ask questions like, should the authorities be doing more monitoring? Should they be increasing enforcement of their existing laws, or maybe something else is going on? So yeah, that's as far as we got toward tracing where the shark fins may have ended up.
So there weren't any international observers on these boats who could have prevented this from happening then. Are they not required to have observers on these kinds of ships?
I guess it goes back to like WCPFC rules and what those rules should be, and, reforms that could be introduced to stop this kind of thing from happening. So, the WCPFC has a rule for observer coverage across fleets operating in its waters. So I think the rule is 5% observer coverage, but there's all kinds of loopholes. So what you see is like not really 5%. So, and then I think observers were like suspended during COVID or something. So yeah, so one policy change that a lot of people have told me is needed is to increase observer coverage to at least 20%, if not a lot more than that. So what observers do is it's like a guy on the boat who is supposed to be, I'm not an expert on this. I think they're supposed to be checking the log books that show the catch. The captain's supposed to keep a log book that says what the boat is catching. The observer checks that, and the observer's there to make sure everything's, that all the rules are being followed, I suppose. So when there's no observers and there's no other monitoring going on, then it's a lot easier for these boats to break the rules. So yeah, so people have argued for increasing observer coverage. Another solution that I've heard put forth is electronic observers. So basically putting cameras on boats. You could, I think Australia, or one jurisdiction within Australia, has started using electronic observers. And I think the way it works is that they have cameras on all the boats, and then they only review 10% of the footage, and it's randomly selected which footage they review. But after they put this policy into place, it seems to have changed the behavior of the fishing boats, or changed the way these boats are reporting their catch or something like that. So yeah, I'm not really an expert on this, but the observer issue is definitely relevant to this whole investigation.
One interesting detail I found in your article about this investigation is that while demand for shark fin soup in China remains, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization put out a report in 2015 that found recorded shark fin imports to mainland China and Hong Kong have actually decreased over the past decade, and that the reasons for that decrease are not entirely clear. It might have something to do with the Chinese government working to curb conspicuous consumption of shark fins, or awareness-raising campaigns targeting the Chinese public, or even increased regulation of shark finning globally. But now these revelations about Dalian Ocean Fishing's illegal shark finning activities have proposed another alternative, that maybe these illegal imports are fulfilling the demand.
So as I understand it, the demand for shark fin soup kind of took off in China in the 90s, or maybe a little earlier, as kind of China's middle class exploded. And it's seen as a delicacy. It's kind of one of these dishes that it's like a status symbol to eat. It's really expensive, and it used to be served at a lot of government banquets. So yeah, what they do is they cut off the fin, they dry it out, and then they harvest what's called fin rays, which are these long noodle-like or needle-like things inside the shark fin, and then they eat the fin rays in the shark fin soup. And yeah, so in the last decade or so, the Chinese government's tried to crack down a little bit on the shark fin trade and the consumption of shark fin soup. They've said you can't serve it at these government banquets anymore. There have been some NGO campaigns working with government to try to reduce demand for shark fin soup, sometimes involving celebrities like Yao Ming, the basketball player, was involved in one of these campaigns. So over the past decade, you've seen a decrease in recorded shark fin imports to China, because a lot of shark fin is actually harvested legally. They take the whole shark and export the fins. And I think Hong Kong is the biggest import-export hub of shark fin in the world. So that's how a lot of the shark fin makes its way onto plates of shark fin soup in China. even though the official data is showing that recorded shark fin imports to Hong Kong and China has decreased over the past decade or so, people aren't really sure why that's happened. Maybe there actually has been a real decrease in demand for shark fin. But another possibility that was raised to me by conservationists that I interviewed was, maybe unreported catches are not being factored into these overall figures. And those, nobody really knows how big these unreported catches are. So unreported imports of shark fin into China. And what we see from our investigation is Dalian Ocean Fishing appears to be bringing shark fin into China without reporting it. I'm sure Dalian Ocean Fishing is not the only company doing this, but it does raise the possibility that vessels are going out and bringing in shark fin without it being recorded.
So have you seen any impacts from your reporting yet? Has Dalian Ocean Fishing responded at all, or has the Chinese government said anything?
So, there's been no real comment from Chinese regulators. It's kind of hard to say. After the Longqing 629 story broke in May 2020, I think the following year, the U.S. government banned imports of tuna originating with this company into the U.S. And that was based on its own research that it had done. And they wrote in their press release about that it was to do with indications of forced labor. So they mentioned the labor issue, but they didn't mention the shark fishing issue. So this company it appears not to have operated since late 2020, when its entire Southeast Asian workforce was repatriated to Indonesia and the Philippines. It appears to be undergoing major financial troubles. Since mid-2019, dozens of lawsuits have been filed against Dalian Ocean Fishing in Chinese courts over unpaid loans and bills. And even today, these lawsuits are still making their way through China's legal system. So I think in late September, some of this company's boats were apparently auctioned off in a judicial auction to pay back some of these creditors. But the company still does have more boats, and some of them are authorized to fish in WCPFC waters and IOTC waters, which is the Indian Ocean tuna regulator, for the next few years. So, and there's other indications that the company plans to resume operations at some point. So it's not really clear exactly what the status of this company is, but it's not, even though it hasn't operated in the past couple of years that we can see, it might start operating again. So in the past couple of years, China has made some policy reforms. They actually banned wire leaders earlier this year in May for boats operating, carrying their flag. But, the question is, how are they going to enforce this new rule? Because observer coverage is still really low. And, China doesn't appear to be doing things like sending its Coast Guard out to the high seas to kind of randomly check on its vessels. So there's a question of enforcement here. You can pass all the rules you want, but how are you going to enforce them?
And now we'll turn to my conversation with Annelise Giseburt. She's a freelance journalist based in Tokyo, Japan, but for the majority of the reporting done for the investigation into Dalian Ocean Fishing, Giseburt was a staff reporter at Tokyo Investigative Newsroom Tansa, one of Mongabay's investigative partners. Aside from its illegal shark finning activities, Dalian Ocean Fishing was mainly in the business of serving the Japanese market, with most of its tuna going to Japan's Mitsubishi Corporation and its seafood trading arm, Toyo Reizo. Here's Giseburt to tell us about how, while the general outlines of the partnership between Dalian and Mitsubishi are pretty well documented, tracing specific tuna flows from individual fishing boats to Mitsubishi's supply chain is really difficult due to the murky nature of the supply chain, which experts say must be addressed in order to prevent illegal fishing and labor abuses at sea.
So the piece that we just recently published, it was a follow-up to Mongabay's piece last year, and then also its recent piece that came out just before this one that was an investigation into a Chinese tuna fishing company called Dalian Ocean Fishing, and they were found to have widespread labor abuses on board, which sometimes ended up in the deaths of multiple crew members. And also, they were found to have been doing systematic shark finning, which is an illegal activity across much of the fleet, or across many of the boats from which Mongabay was able to interview crew. And so this company, the majority of their tuna, as far as we can tell, was sold to the Japanese sashimi tuna market. And in past documents, the company had said that their largest customer was Mitsubishi Corporation and its seafood trading arm, Toyo Reizo.
So your report was at least in part based on interviews with the same crew from Dalian Ocean Fishing's boats as the investigation into the illegal shark finning activities. Did you speak to the crew members yourself?
That was Basten, who's based in Indonesia. He was the one interviewing a lot of the crew. I actually never spoke to any of them directly. I just was shared with I received the transcripts from those interviews. But I think that's a really great example of collaborative investigative reporting, that we are able to focus on our individual areas of expertise and then share our findings to get a clearer and more detailed overall picture of what this industry and this specific supply chain was like.
So your main focus in your reporting was to untangle this relationship between Dalian Ocean Fishing and Mitsubishi?
Yeah, so basically when I joined this investigation, the main, task that I had to complete was to verify that this now a little bit outdated document by Dalian Ocean Fishing's parent company explaining the company's business was still accurate. And specifically by that, this document had stated that the company's main business partner, or the company purchasing the majority of its tuna, was Toyo Reizo, this Mitsubishi seafood trading arm, and that in that document from 2014, they said Toyo Reizo and Mitsubishi are only customers in Japan. And so when we're doing this investigation now in late 2020 and throughout the majority of 2021, we wanted to see whether that business relationship still existed. And the way to do that would be to trace whether the tuna caught by DOF was coming to market in Japan, and whether Mitsubishi and Toyo Reizo were the ones purchasing it once it came to Japan. But there's very, very low transparency in Japan's imported tuna supply chain, probably, and I'm sure that's not unique to Japan. I'm sure imported seafood and also distant water fishing in particular, often, no matter where it is, has a really, really murky supply chain. So that proved to have a lot of difficulties in being able to accurately trace the flow of tuna. But I guess to summarize, we had to trace from the tuna fishing boat to a kind of boat called a refrigerated cargo ship, which is a big sort of vessel that has 3 floors, I suppose, of these really big freezers, and it's capable of carrying boatloads and boatloads and boatloads of frozen tuna from the open ocean to market in Japan or other ports. So we had to trace the tuna from the fishing vessels to the refrigerated cargo ships, also known as reefers, and then from there to ports in Japan. And at the ports in Japan to try and see whether or not we could find out who had actually purchased them. So there were multiple steps of the supply chain we had to look into, and in many cases it was impossible to fully trace the supply chain. But in a number of incidences, it seemed likely that this DOF tuna had made it back to Japan, and then in one instance, we were able to confirm the entire supply chain. So based on that information, when towards the end of our investigation, I put questions directly to Mitsubishi Corporation, they said, yes, we have been purchasing tuna from Dalian Ocean Fishing.
And these refrigerated cargo ships, or reefers, of course, make a practice known as transshipment possible. Can you explain to our listeners what transshipment is, why it's so important to distant water fishing fleets, and how it can help enable labor and environmental abuses?
So transshipment is sort of just a general term that means the transfer of catch, meaning some sort of fish product, or the transfer of goods from ship to ship. And it can happen in port sometimes, but it can also happen on the open ocean, very far from port and very far from any kind of land. And that's specifically the type of transshipment we were looking at in this investigation, because that's what DOF's fleet was engaging in. And so basically, once the fishing vessel has caught enough tuna and its own freezers are full, it will get a refrigerated cargo ship, reefer, to come and pick up the tuna. And in one voyage, a refrigerated cargo ship can have, according to someone with experience in this industry, they can have up to 100 transshipments of catch before going back to port. And I should also add that the refrigerated cargo ship can also bring goods to the fishing vessel, like, for example, new bait or other kinds of supplies, either for the fishing operation or for the crew living on board, like simple food supplies, for example. And then there are also ships that will transship oil or fuel for the fishing vessels as well, but that's separate from the refrigerated cargo ship. Because the reefers take the tuna and catch from the fishing vessel and also give it supplies in return, this enables the fishing vessels to stay out in the open ocean, in the distant water, for up to a year or two at a time without ever returning to port. And where the risks start to increase in this structure of fishing and shipping is that because the ships don't return to port, there's no way for crew to leave the vessel. They're just stuck at sea. We heard even a story from one former crew member on DOF's vessels that one of his fellow crew members, a migrant worker from Indonesia, he wanted to leave the vessel because he didn't like the living and working conditions, and he tried to get the captain to send him back home, but the captain apparently was refusing. And so in his desperation, this crew member tried to flee to a refrigerated cargo ship that had come to pick up tuna. So this crew member jumped over to the refrigerated cargo ship, but apparently the reefer's captain made him just go back to the fishing vessel. The crew member that we interviewed said, quote, because it was problematic. So we're not quite sure what the details of that would be, but according to another expert I spoke to about this, it could potentially be that the crew members don't have their own passport, like, in their own possession. The passports are kept safe by the officers or by the captains. Maybe one reason for that is so the crew doesn't just lose them, because that would be a problem, but also because the captain has the passports, the crew can't just leave whenever they want to. And so another point about isolating the crews is that on the open ocean, they often don't have cell signal or Wi-Fi access. So if they are in a dangerous or unhealthy situation, it's really difficult for them to tell anyone or to ask for help. And other crew we interviewed, one of them mentioned that actually when the refrigerated cargo ship or also the oil or fuel tanker would come, sometimes that was the only time they could get a Wi-Fi signal and be able to text their families back home. Because transshipment allows vessels to stay out at sea for up to years at a time, it really isolates crew and can prevent them from leaving a harmful situation. That's basically the long and short of it.
You used satellite data from Global Fishing Watch to look at the reefers used by Mitsubishi. What did you find?
Yeah, so Global Fishing Watch is a online platform, and if you register, it's free to use, that contains satellite data about the fishing industries. And one type of data it offers is location data for fishing vessels and also refrigerated cargo ships. And it will also offer specific data points where a refrigerated cargo ship and a fishing vessel were next to each other, unmoving for a couple hours at a time. And Global Fishing Watch calls these incidents, encounters. If there is an encounter at sea, so two boats next to each other not moving for a couple hours, it's possible that a transshipment has taken place, either of fish or of goods. But because it's only based on location data that's then collected via satellite, not any kind of image data of what actually happened on board, it's impossible to know from just the Global Fishing Watch's encounter data whether or not a transshipment took place. But it's possible to get sort of a rough idea of the movement of these vessels. And of course, this data on Global Fishing Watch is also far from complete, because sometimes fishing vessels will simply not be sending any location data. So there are huge gaps in the data, especially for the smaller fishing vessels. So for example, when I would look at a DOF vessel, even if the vessel was listed on Global Fishing Watch and had a bit of data, maybe it would only have 1 or 2 encounters listed. However, on the other hand, for the refrigerated cargo ships, since they are, I guess, bigger and more official vessels, they would often have really good location data. And so it was much easier to see a list of encounters for the refrigerated cargo ships. And sometimes if they were just hanging out in the ocean, not moving, but there wasn't any data for a vessel they would be hanging out next to, it would just be labeled as, I think it was labeled as loitering or something like that. I don't remember the exact term, but basically there would also be data points for when these vessels would just be stopped at sea for a number of hours. And there were many data points like that when the fishing vessel data was incomplete. So, although as I just said, there are lots of gaps in the data, there were a certain number of instances where a DOF vessel would have an encounter with a reefer. Or I guess I looked at the reefers through a number of different, categories. For some that I paid the most attention to, there were reefers that the crew remembered transshipping with. And one of these was a vessel called Lady Tuna, where some crew would say, we transferred tuna to a reefer named Lady Tuna. And Lady Tuna was also listed on Toyo Reizo's website as one of the reefers that brings tuna from parts of its supply chain to port in Japan. So that was one vessel that I focused on. But then partway through looking at this vessel data, I realized that I needed to be sort of casting a wider net, as it were, and looking at many more refrigerated cargo ships, not only the ones specifically with clear Mitsubishi Toyo Reizo ties. And so one source I used, there's a list published by Japan's Fisheries agency that includes a number of refrigerated cargo ships that are authorized to pick up tuna in certain areas of the world's oceans. That list is also not complete. I found data on Global Fishing Watch of other vessels bringing tuna to Japan that weren't on this list, but it was a good starting point. And then also simply by looking at the DOF vessels on Global Fishing Watch, even if they would only have 1 or 2 records of encounters at sea with reefers, then if it was a reefer that I didn't think was tied to Mitsubishi and Toyo Reizo, but they still had an encounter with it, I would end up looking into that reefer's management details, etc., and seeing what sort of link and what sort of role it might be playing there as well.
You mentioned that you spoke to Mitsubishi and they did confirm that they were buying tuna from Dalian Ocean Fishing. Did Mitsubishi have any comment about any of these abuses Dalian has been accused of at this point?
First of all, I should definitely clarify that when I did put these questions about the findings of our investigation to Mitsubishi, they said, while we did do business with DOF in the past, and that was roughly based on our own investigation and then the response they gave there, that was roughly 20 years that they have been purchasing tuna from DOF. But that business relationship ended as soon as those 4 deaths were initially reported. And their responses were a little bit vague as to whether or not those deaths or the news of those deaths were the incident that made them stop the business relationship. But when I asked about that reason, they said something to the effect of, at the very least, we're not going to be doing any business with this company until all the facts of this incident have come to light. And so that's what they said roughly 1 year ago when we in Mongabay were first publishing the results of this investigation. And then when I emailed them or communicated with them again for this piece on transshipment for Mongabay that came out recently, they said again that was the last time. It was in April 2020 is when they said the last time they had purchased tuna from DOF was, and then in early May 2020 is when those 4 initial deaths were first widely known. And then that's when they said their business relationship ended. So since May 2020, up till now, they have had no dealings with DOF. And since then, when I was communicating with them last year, they said they stopped the business relationship. And then this year, when I was checking back in with them and asking a few additional questions, they highlighted that they had implemented, they meaning Mitsubishi Corporation and its subsidiary Toyorezo, they have a new set of guidelines for tuna procurement, which are much stricter than what the corporation was doing in the past in order to verify that no illegal activity or abuse is happening in its supply chain. So it appears, I'm not able to say, of course, what exactly was the inciting incident or which organization's work prompted this change. I'm sure it's the sum of the work of NGOs as well as many different media organizations looking into this issue. But it has apparently prompted new policies by Mitsubishi and more stricter oversight of their tuna procurement business.
Given how convoluted the tuna supply chain is, do consumers have any way of knowing where their tuna is coming from?
It's still really difficult for consumers to know where their tuna is coming from. I think maybe if they wanted to directly ask the suppliers, then perhaps they might be given information, but I can't say for sure. In our own investigation, when we asked Mitsubishi whether they would be able to tell us how DOF's tuna was made available to consumers, they said they cannot provide us with that information because it would violate confidentiality with their customers. And as a really big seafood distributor in Japan, Mitsubishi and Toyorezo have customers that include like big supermarket chains or wholesalers like fish markets, and then also apparently major restaurants as well, is my understanding. So it's really difficult to know where this seafood goes. And so while working on this investigation, I would go to my, neighborhood supermarket and look at the tuna sashimi sold there. And on the package, it only says the ocean where the tuna was caught, like say this was caught in the Pacific Ocean, and it would say maybe it was caught by fleets or vessels belonging to multiple countries potentially, like it would be Taiwan, Korea, China, etc. That sort of thing would be written on the package. So no detailed information about the specific suppliers providing this tuna is made available to consumers.
As you mentioned in your article, the U.S. banned imports of tuna and other seafood products caught by Dalian Ocean Fishing in May 2021. But the company's main customers are mostly in East Asia anyway, especially Japan. You write that it's not so easy for Japan to implement a similar ban on tuna linked with forced labor. Can you tell us why that is?
The U.S. has a legal system put in place already where they can ban products that they suspect are produced using forced labor. And so that's not only for the tuna industry or not only the fishing industry. My understanding is that it's sort of across the board for any product. But in Japan, they don't have a similar legal mechanism in place to ban products produced with forced labor. So if an incident like this with DOF comes to light, even if, say, they wanted to ban the DOF's products, it would be maybe difficult to find a legal basis for that, given the existing laws. Or at least, that's what I was told when I was talking to the Fisheries agency about this. They said there's no framework in place to just ban the products because of that. And I think given the lack of a legal framework, it's difficult for the government to take action. And so then it's on to the individual companies like Mitsubishi and Toyorezo to say, we're not going to do business with this supplier. And so Japan did recently create a new law that gives additional legal framework for banning IUU seafood, and IUU being illegal, different kinds of illegal seafood. But the law is applied on a species by species basis and doesn't apply to. Well, first of all, it doesn't yet apply to tuna, and then second of all, it doesn't include anything about forced labor or other labor rights abuses. So while these mechanisms are starting to be put in place, there's still a lot of gaps in the legal system. So that sort of ties Japan's hands, in a sense, for how much they can respond when cases like this do come to light.
Do you have a sense of how widespread across the fishing industry these kinds of labor and environmental abuses might be? And what could be done to rein in companies like Dalian Ocean Fishing before 4 deckhands die on their boats?
I'm definitely not the most knowledgeable person about the extent of abuses at sea. But according to the reports I've read by nonprofits such as Greenpeace or the Environmental Justice Foundation, who both work on the issues of labor abuses at sea, it seems like it's quite a widespread issue, and not just labor abuses, but also shark finning and other environmental crimes like that as well. Yeah, so it's an extensive issue, and I'm sure the problem isn't limited to DOF, and it's not limited to, say, Mitsubishi and Toyo Reizo on the purchaser side in Japan as well. I think so many corporations would be implicated to a certain extent if everyone's business activities in the fishing industry were investigated to the extent that we've investigated the DOF incident. And for how these issues can be addressed, one thing that one former member of a nonprofit that we spoke to, he was saying that from the stance of his nonprofit, he would choose to ban the practice of transshipment at sea because that isolates crew and prevents a lot of the activities of these fishing vessels from being made known to authorities. But fishing companies say that without transshipment at sea, that their businesses would just go under because it takes too much fuel and too much time to go back and forth to the port every time these fishing vessels have their freezers full of tuna. So it's sort of at, I guess, a certain impasse. There are some cases where I've heard of a country putting bans on transshipment or instituting rules that say a fishing vessel would have to come back to port once every a certain number of months, for example. But I think it's my understanding that's still not super widely implemented, and certainly not implemented in Japan's case. So if transshipment at sea is here to stay for the moment, things that would potentially help might be, say, expanding the areas to which observers working on working on reefers are able to check, and also placing international observers on fishing vessels as well. But that sort of thing would come with its own set of risks as well. There have been incidents of these observers who have gone missing or who felt they were in danger while working on fishing vessels or in their other work as an observer. So another thing, one thing that was included in Mitsubishi's new procurement guidelines is that they said they would think about how to advocate for further monitoring of fishing vessels, if not by a person, then maybe through other technological means. But a lot of these ideas are still not widely implemented. So there's a lot more work to be done to ensure that the distant water fishing supply chain is transparent and that crews are protected, and that, of course, these observers would be protected as well.
Just to wrap up, can you say something about why your reporting on Mitsubishi was an important extension of the broader investigation into Dalian Ocean Fishing?
I think in terms of how this story is relevant for Japan is that there's really low understanding in Japan about where some of their tuna comes from and what takes place on these fishing vessels catching wild tuna for the Japanese market. And so because all these incidents happen way out at sea, beyond anyone's sight, and then also on foreign fishing vessels as well. So there's a real disconnect between the supply chain and then the market and then the consumers. So I think this investigation was important in linking those two, and that's saying consumers in Japan and the big companies importing this seafood. Of course, we focused on Mitsubishi and Toyo Reizo, but I'm sure this would apply to any of the seafood importers, that they have as these economic powerhouses and the biggest sashimi tuna market in the world. They have a huge responsibility for ethically sourcing their seafood and for ensuring that the vulnerable workers on board these fishing vessels aren't being exploited in order to catch tuna and make money from that tuna. Yeah, so I think for me that would be the biggest takeaway, is connecting the fishers to the consumers and connecting everyone in between.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. If you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mongabay newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to our new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off.